focus on young people who are white in your community, who should be socialized to anti-racism in a way that requires building different muscles for them, different social practices for them, different understandings that being colorblind is a form of racism, because it abets the status quo and essentially says that the normal and universal is a white standard and a white person, which then creates, the track for assimilation for everybody else, which of course is itself the dominant form of cultural supremacy in this country.
We are thrilled to partner with GBH for tonight's program examining racial justice in America, reflections on the past, present, and future. Tonight we'll examine issues of race and inequality across the United States. Over the last year, several instances of high-profile police violence aimed at people of color have come to the forefront. Widely accessible imagery and narratives of these instances, along with the intersection of the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, are fueling a national outcry and galvanizing demands for police reform and racial justice. In this discussion, we'll examine how structural racism has fueled inequity and reflect on its impact on the legacy of racial injustice in the United States. We will explore how America's current engagement in fighting racial oppression differs from previous movements, and we will look ahead to the future and the hope and plans for meaningful change. And finally, we will consider what our individual and collective roles might be in this work. On our distinguished panel tonight includes Dr. Keisha Blain, Associate Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh and the President of the African American Intellectual History Society. She is a current fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard. She serves as editor for the Washington Post's Made by History section, and her latest book is 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, edited with Ibram Kendi. Also joining us is Dr. Khalil Muhammad, Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is the former director of the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library. And moderating our panel is Kat Stafford, a national investigative reporter at the Associated Press covering race and inequity. Previously, she was a reporter at the Detroit Free Press. She is the deputy chair of the National Association of Black Journalists. So now let's turn things over to Kat Stafford. Kat?
Gavin, thank you so much for that just wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight for what I hope will be a very lively discussion. And honestly, I can't think of a more appropriate topic for us to be discussing tonight. As Gavin noted, right now, the nation is still grappling with what I call the convergence of three national crises, right? The COVID pandemic, the economic fallout of the pandemic, and of course, the racial justice movement that saw millions of Americans take to the streets over the summer after the police killing of George Floyd. And all of these issues, of course, are things that uniquely impact people of color and Black Americans in this nation. But I want to be clear, race permeates everything. Race intersects everything. And it's not just people of color who have to deal with race. We have to be prepared to have honest conversations. So I am very honored to lead this discussion tonight, and let's just hop straight into it. So one of the things that I've really found over this past year of covering just race and again, how it intersects with everything is that a lot of people don't know or understand really the full definitions of what we mean when we're talking about racism. So Keisha and Khalil, I was hoping that you guys could kind of break down for us, what do we mean when we talk about the differences between institutional racism, individual racism, and structural or systemic racism? Can we start there by discussing what exactly does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Kat. It's wonderful to be in conversation tonight with you and with Khalil. I'll offer a few comments, and then open up some space for Khalil to jump in, because the question you've asked is a big one and grapples with, I think, various dimensions of how we experience racism in this country. So I think for many people, most people understand, I think, individual racism, which is to say that when we talk about the interactions that take place between individuals, whereby someone, for example, might use the N-word, clearly when that happens, and unfortunately it happens still too often, individuals are able to say, oh, that was a racist remark and that was an act of racism. And I think for the most part, people understand and see, that kind of rhetoric as racist. They understand that in calling someone the N-word, it is a way to demean the person. Certainly, it is a way to underscore that the person is not at equal or equal level to another group of individuals. And so that becomes, I think, probably the easiest kind of expression of racism that one can explain, because it's so visible in our faces. And then you talk about institutional racism, and of course, we're having this conversation thinking about, for example, educational inequality, and thinking about how there are structures in place, how there are policies, procedures in place that ultimately reinforce inequality, that ultimately make it difficult, right? Even when individuals are doing their very best, they are dealing with these external factors. They're dealing with institutional practices that ultimately make it very difficult for them to experience equal opportunities. And so I think oftentimes that's when we end up having debates, because some people have a hard time seeing that. And part of it is truly, I think, understanding the history, which of course we'll talk about tonight, but the history certainly makes it clear how institutional racism has been in the making for a very long time. And so I'll stop there and allow some space for Khalil to jump in.
Now, this is going to be fun tonight, because I'm not used to being able to share the conversation with such a great interlocutor and co-panelist. So I'm just going to back up Keisha with three very quick examples. We can think of individual racism as Bull Connor or Mark Furman, bracketing the Southern Sheriff in Birmingham and the infamous LAPD detective who was the racist in that story of O.J. Simpson's trial. And then we can think of institutional racism more recently as, say, Wells Fargo as a bank that systematically targeted Black borrowers and customers for subprime loans and or for additional accounts. They did this to brown people too, and a whole bunch of white folks. But the focus on African Americans as a specific targeted group within the context of that particular bank is a good example of institutional racism. And then finally, you can think of structural racism as the financial sector more generally, or the housing sector. Both sectors price Black assets lower and charge higher rates of access to capital for Black borrowers of one kind or another. And that is because race is a pricing instrument in the United States. It assigns value regardless of the individual. So that's one way to think of very specific examples of how we move from individual to an organization or an institution to a system that operates quite efficiently by sorting people in racial categories.
And those are excellent examples. Thank you both for the very detailed answers to that question. I just want to re-up something that was posted in the chat. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I'll be sure to get to them later. So I want to talk a little bit about the history. One thing that, just reporting a lot on COVID that I found was that it was so necessary to include that history in nuance to really explain to readers what led us to this moment as to why you're seeing such a disparate impact and toll on people of color in this country. So for the both of you, this is kind of a sweeping question, but what would you say led us to this moment where we are now facing this very convergence of multiple crises in this moment? What laid the foundation for where we are today?
Well, where do you begin? I think so many times when people ask me this question, I immediately think about slavery, and I have to start there because even and this is true, I think, even when we're talking about inequality as it pertains to wealth or educational inequality, and you asked specifically about health, and one can see, I think, decades of medical racism, of medical abuse, that certainly helps to explain how we ended up in this place. When you look at healthcare across the nation, it is no secret that that Black people, Black and Brown people in this country do not have quality access to quality healthcare when compared to other racial groups. So that's one thing. And so here we are at a moment in time where COVID-19 hits, and COVID-19 is new, but what is clear is that there were already, I think, clearly decades in the making, which laid a foundation that I think ultimately meant few people were surprised when we saw the data and we saw that Black communities in particular were being devastated by COVID-19, and there's a lot of conversation about, for example, wearing masks. Several studies have revealed that in fact Black people do wear masks, and in fact do compared to other racial groups are taking the necessary precautions. But what's clear is that, one, if you don't have quality healthcare, and if you don't even have access to, for example, places where you can purchase good groceries and have options, or the fact that you might be dealing with poverty, and therefore that just means that from the outset you're not able to get the kind of healthcare and support that you need to have a life, a quality, a life at the highest quality. I mean, I think all of these come together and then created a situation whereby we saw, and it's now clear through the data, that COVID-19 ends up devastating Black communities at a significantly, I think, higher rate than other racial groups. So in a nutshell, it is about understanding a process by which we can talk about decades and, quite frankly, centuries in the making, whether we're talking about medical abuse, whether we're talking about medical racism, whether we're talking about limited access to quality education, and quality healthcare in particular.
Hey, Khalil, what about you? I'm thinking especially just about how George Floyd, his death really catapulted this movement for racial justice right now, but this is nothing new. I mean, we've seen decades and centuries of Black men, Black women, and Black children die at the hands of police and other authority type figures. So can you kind of talk about it from that aspect, that historical legacy?
Sure. So I think that we have to see George Floyd's death in a continuum of the use of law enforcement to control Black lives and Black bodies. On one hand, that's quite obvious in the context of colonial and antebellum slavery. Slave patrollers and other means of militia were empowered to distribute corporal punishment, including death, for in any example where African Americans were threatening by virtue of pursuing their own freedom and liberty. So the fact of stealing oneself was a crime and subject to corporal punishment or death. So that's obvious. Of course, the harnessing of Black labor in the period after slavery was the business of creating the New South. And the coercive instruments of the criminal justice system created a political economy of punishment that had nothing to do with individual guilt or innocence. In fact, it was very much about mass criminalization and collective guilt. That is, that Black people's second-class citizenship was the status quo, and anything that was a pursuit of full freedom was essentially a crime for much of the Black population until the Great Migration period. And even in the context of the Great Migration period, as Black people moved north and sought their freedom dreams, as they sought to escape the terrors of lynch mobs, as they became what Brian Stevenson has once described or consistently described as refugees in their own country, they were then subject to much more systematized bureaucratic procedural forms of law enforcement that were less about the sheriff and deputies abetting a lynch mob, but in fact did the work of policing the boundaries of Black communities. We bring that forward. We have built since the 1960s the largest edifice of law enforcement and punishment the world has ever known. And that project has been distinctly related to both the demographic shifts of Black America, South to North, rural to urban, but also the political shifts of Black America as Black people sought to hold accountable the nation's leaders to the promises of the 14th Amendment. And we are in a season of really wonderful filmmaking. I want to draw the folks on this Zoom to the recent award-winning Gold Globe-winning film, Judas and the Black Messiah, which tells the story of Fred Hampton's assassination, part of a conspiracy that involved FBI agents, and one in particular, William O'Neill. This season of counterintelligence to bring down Black freedom movements, which is very much a part of Keisha's own scholarship, is part of the story of law enforcement in this country. And the relationship of that political attack within law enforcement, white supremacist infiltration, and in fact, that's probably putting it nicely, infiltration, very much cozy with law enforcement over many decades in the 20th century, and most recently with the FBI reporting that white supremacist groups have in fact infiltrated a number of agencies in the United States, tells us that the story of George Floyd is part of a 401-year history of a very flawed, and indeed flawed from the perspective of Black lives, very intentional and deliberately designed system of racial control that we call law enforcement in this country. And the one thing I just want to add quickly is, if we only focus on the deaths, many critics will point out that only a small number of Black people and white people, something like less than 30, are killed annually as unarmed people. Thousands are killed in the course of a range of circumstances, which is still too many. But I want to make the point that we have nearly 100 pattern and practice investigations going back since the 1990s. And these are about the kind of daily abuses that range from people being smacked around to being assaulted, insulted, some cases sexually abused, which fall well short of lethal force, but are still excessive uses of force and are daily indignities that Black citizens have too often endured.
So I want to take the chance to insert an audience question that we had submitted earlier and kind of tweak it just a little bit. So this question is, how does the anti-racism and anti-white supremacy training of the 60s and 70s resemble or differ from the approach used today? And the reason I wanted to really ask that question is because I know this Sunday, of course, marks the 56th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the Selma Montgomery marches, right? So I think it's kind of a timely question. So just curious to get you guys' thoughts on how what we saw then, how does it translate to today and what we're seeing?
Well, I think there are some similarities and some differences. I think clearly when we are talking about the modern civil rights movement, and we can think about the work of, for example, activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the sit-ins as one example of clearly, certainly direct protests, but nonviolent to activism, which is very much connected to a lot of what's taking place today, whereby people might not, do sit-ins as much, but certainly we had a string of die-ins, for example, where people would just, and of course this is pre-COVID in particular, would occupy certain spaces, public spaces, in order to disrupt and similarly use their physical bodies the way that activists in SNCC did in the 1960s in restaurants and other places, that within the Black Lives Matter movement today, we see that as a particular tactic. But it is important to remember, I think, that what follows, and certainly is deeply connected in the history, is the period of Black power, whereby activists were advocating armed self-defense, were certainly, one could say, more militant in their approach. And all of that factors into understanding Black Lives Matter, for example, as a movement today. So I would argue that the movement draws upon, right, both of these traditions, which are deeply intertwined, clearly nonviolent activism, but to an extent, a militant response to white supremacy, which certainly can be far more confrontational, right? And still, I think, equally important and together, I think, reveal to us just a glimpse of the varied strategies that Black activists have used historically to challenge racism and continue to use today to challenge racism.
Khalil, would you like to jump in on that?
Sure, I'll just say that, I mean, I think one of the most revealing aspects of the lessons learned from the 1960s for Black activists today dealing with systemic racism and policing is their decentralized leadership model. And so, whereas the example I just gave in the last answer about the assassination of Fred Hampton, who was very much organizing in a broader context that saw law enforcement as the defenders of the systems of racism that diminish the quality of life for African Americans, and in his case, in organizing for Puerto Ricans, as well as for a community of white Northerners who were considered low income, poor whites in Chicago. So clearly, when Fred Hampton was killed, that movement suffered greatly, as was true of many who either were assassinated or were jailed, or terrorized into no longer participating in the movement. BLM activists for over a decade had resisted the model of a patriarchal singular leader who could be identified as a spokesperson for a movement. This movement is also quite queer, and I mean that both in terms of sexuality, which is an important part of the movement, recognizing that everyone has to be brought along towards liberation as they would define it, but also recognizing that it's a very local movement with national goals. And by that, they are very clear that a lot of the action is with City Hall. A lot of the action is with a local or municipal police department or the local FOP. And I think in that way, this movement feels less cohesive. And until we saw the 15 to 30 million people out in the streets this summer, people might have even questioned whether or not the BLM movement had survived the Trump era. But what they were missing was capacity building. They were missing the way that movement was deepening its local roots to be prepared to take advantage of opportunities when those opportunities emerge. And that's precisely what happened this summer.
And so, of course, we have the Black Lives Matter movement. We also have the movement for Black Lives. And I was just having a discussion with a colleague today. We were kind of talking about how a lot of folks know their work around criminal justice reform, right? But they also have very key initiatives around environmental justice, around economic justice, so many different things that I think the average American might not be aware of. So do you believe this current movement has staying power to not just potentially enact change on the criminal justice front, but some of these other key issues that we know are also just as important to Black Americans and other people of color?
I certainly think so. And I would add too that one of the powerful aspects, certainly of Black Lives Matter, but specifically, as you pointed out, a movement for Black lives, is the internationalist dimensions. And I think we've certainly been talking about Black America, and what is also important, and to an extent we saw that on display just a few months ago with the uprisings, is how much what is taking place on US soil, that the movement that's taking place on US soil is very much connected to global struggles for liberation across so many diverse places. So I'm thinking about certainly across Europe, thinking about Canada, as just, quick examples of places where we have seen movements and Black Lives Matter chapters emerging, connecting to the struggle in the US, but also attending to national concerns in their context. So trying to address anti-Black racism, within their own communities. And so I certainly do think it has staying power. And I think what is powerful too about this moment, and for me, I think as a historian, it's so rewarding in many ways to see how much these efforts are so connected to earlier efforts. And that's why I mentioned earlier, just the very traditions. What's beautiful in my mind about this moment as activists come together is how they're pulling inspiration from, for example, the Combahee River Collective, right, of the 1970s, how they're pulling, from SNCC that I mentioned earlier, how they're pulling from the Black Panther Party. And so it really is pulling, one might say, all of these ideas, all of these traditions, and harnessing them in a way that we can, I think, come together and effectively tackle racism, certainly in the US context, but also on a global scale.
Khalil, would you like to chime in on this?
No, I think Keisha covered it.
Great. So I want to stay with the Black Lives Matter movement for a little bit, but kind of forward into the presidential election. Do either of you believe that these protests that we saw, this swell of activism on the ground, what sort of impact did it have on the presidential election? And do you believe, especially for now President Joe Biden, did a lot of these protests kind of force him to really address systemic racism in a way that we have not seen, at least in recent memory, in terms of a presidential candidate?
Yeah, so I'll admit I have not tried to look for research or reporting on making a causative link between the protests and the election outcome. I think that there's a kind of irony of history that Joe Biden was selected by South Carolina voters as one of the centrist presidential primary contenders for the Democratic Party prior to the protests. And it begs the question to what extent things might have played out differently had a more progressive candidate been the nominee at the time that the protests were unfolding during the summer. I think that we know here, here is what we know. We know that Trump yet again got a majority of the white population. He lost some ground, surprisingly, against some working class white male voters, particularly in some of those swing states. At the same time, he gained some ground amongst Black men who increased their percentage for Trump from 8% to 12%. He also surprisingly gained voters in the broader Hispanic and Latinx community while losing some of those same voters in key states. So it's a very mixed, complicated picture with regard to how people reacted to the protests. It's also true that Trump got more votes than any presidential candidate in history. And of course, Biden got even more. And so it's really hard to say exactly how this got parsed. I think that what I'd feel more comfortable saying is that it polarized the electorate in ways that people who might have been fence straddlers, not to say they would have stayed home, were more motivated to show up at the polls. And that motivation redounded to the benefit of the Democrats, particularly because so many of the places where Biden was able to sweep Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, those places, those were places where motivation was a big, big deal. And certainly Georgia with the final Senate runoff was as well.
And Keisha, if you don't mind, I would love to shift the conversation towards, since Khalil just mentioned Georgia. One of the most extraordinary stories that I covered in the past year was just the way that Black women organizers were really able to work on the ground within their own communities to galvanize people to not just head to the polls, but to submit absentee ballots far in advance. And, you know, one of the common themes that I heard from a lot of the women that I spoke with was they were building this work upon a legacy that already existed. Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, so many Black women. So can you talk about the role that Black women played in both the presidential and as well as the Georgia Senate runoffs?
Sure. And so it's absolutely true, as people are pointing out, that when we look at the remarkable efforts of Black women just this past year, that these women are absolutely building on a longer tradition. And it's great that you mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer, because Fannie Lou Hamer is someone who I just think beautifully encapsulates so many, well, on the one hand, a recognition that electoral politics is fundamental, and that grassroots politics is fundamental. So for her, it was making sure that people were certainly dealing with voter suppression first, and trying to register as many people as possible in the context of the U.S. South in the 1960s, and to play a significant role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which, as we know, is now under attack. But for her, it was rallying people at the grassroots level, making sure that they were truly, I think, motivated at a period, at a moment in time where there was so much to quite frankly, one could feel so defeated with everything that was going on the local level and on the national level. And just thinking about, just as a quick example, racial violence and as one factor. But for Fannie Lou Hamer, it was about how do you galvanize people at the grassroots, regardless of whatever their background might be, regardless of their socioeconomic status, and to get them to see that as American citizens, that they could use the vote as a way to improve their social condition, right? And on top of that, she was someone who was constantly, several times running for office, attempting to serve in that capacity. So one can see all of these efforts through the work of Black women in Georgia, but also I think just across the nation in recent years. And it is, it's somewhat ironic, I think, that while we have this long history of Black women's activism, which certainly even, transformed the Democratic Party, and just as one quick example, there is still a fight for Black women to be respected and recognized, even within the Democratic Party, but I think in American society at large. So on the one hand, we can celebrate Stacey Abrams, and it's wonderful that we're doing that now, but I also remember not too long before that, people were being very disparaging and saying awful things about Stacey Abrams and so many others, because we have yet to fully, I think, embrace and respect Black women for their leadership, which, as I noted, has been so fundamental to the making of American democracy.
And so, Khalil, I'd like to come back with you with this very specific question. So one of the things that, I've kind of come into a lot with my work is how many activists and just civil rights leaders feel that oftentimes the burden is placed upon people of color, upon Black Americans to have these conversations and to push for change when it comes to the fight for racial equity in this country. So is this time different? Thinking back to the civil rights movement, after everyone saw what happened on Bloody Sunday, we saw a surge of support among white Americans for the movement, but over time, that support waned. So when you think about today, when you think about George Floyd, is this time different? Or what do you think could happen this time? Does this have staying power?
Yeah, so if I'm wearing my historian's hat, I'll say that if history is any guide, then this time will not be different. That we've seen a consistent pattern of racial fatigue follow significant moments of racial unrest and transformation. And so we can literally map the moments, a generation and a half, 50 years at most, where we see, Black people making tremendous strides and pressures and significant resistance following in the wake. So I think that what gives us the chance in this moment to change the dynamic and learn from history, I think is the way that I want to answer this question. So one of the lessons we did not follow at the end of the civil rights era was that as there was tremendous heterogeneity amongst activists of one kind or another, from Pan-Africanists to cultural nationalists to Marxists to integrationists to assimilationists. I mean, it was just tremendous diversity within African-American community with regard to how to move forward. And I shouldn't even say that Black community, because by the mid to late 1960s, there were multiple generations of particularly Caribbean and West Indian immigrants within the movement, at just shy of what we would see after the 1960s with increased presence of African immigrants. So this heterogeneity and this diversity was focused on how Black people could seize power and take the reins of self-determination to one degree or another, or to work within established networks of allies and interracial coalitions. The one thing that held all of that together, in my opinion, is that it was focused on what Black people could be doing to transform and or make a difference for Black lives. What was not generally happening was that there was very little pressure on white people to change their attitudes and behavior, to rewire the institutions that were private institutions, for example. There was a lot of focus on government and politics and electoral politics in particular. But I am really struck looking back now at a number of thinkers during that time period who kept pointing to white people and saying, what are you going to do to change your behavior in this moment? And we didn't take them up on it. There was no mass movement, as Dr. King noted in his final book, to get white people to let go of their own racial ignorance. This is one of the most powerful statements that he shares with James Baldwin, who by 1963 and in many interviews over a long life, and up until his death in the 1980s, kept saying that the greatest crime committed by Europeans and white Americans in particular on the devastation of Black bodies was their innocence, was their commitment to not knowing and not wanting to know what had happened, including their own history of this nation. And so that ignorance, that unwillingness, that feigned innocence is the unfinished business of this moment in 2021. And if white people commit themselves to learning from the past, to understanding systemic racism, to looking squarely at the facts in front of us, then I think we have a real chance at a new America, literally. But if they're not, then I think they're going to leave a hanging chad in the democratic process of transformation in this country.
And so we have just a few more minutes before I'll shift to the Q&A with the audience. But Keisha, I did want to try and fit this one question in. So we can't have this conversation about racism without talking about the January 6th insurrection. That morning, I was on the phone actually with a key Georgia organizer. And, as it started to unfold, we just sat there in silence and watched. What should have been a morning of celebration, he said, quickly turned into a realization of how far we have to go in this country. So how much of what happened on January 6th do you view as a part of the racism conversation that we're having right now? One of the things that the activist said was he felt as if it was a direct response to the fact that Black voters, brown voters across the nation really came out and let their voices be heard. So what role did racism play in the insurrection?
Mm-hmm. It played a very prominent role. And in fact, I think every time I reflect on the insurrection, there's just one image that comes to mind, which I think is true for many of us, and that is someone carrying the Confederate battle flag, right, and just walking through the Capitol. That was a moment where I think and not the only moment, but certainly one that stood out for me symbolically, and one that connects deeply to understanding why we have to talk about the January 6th insurrection as part of a longer history of racism and white supremacy, and specifically racist violence. Why have a Confederate battle flag? Why, when there are all of these claims that the only reason that people were there was to challenge supposedly an election that they felt was ultimately stolen. Now, if in fact that is truly what the argument is, and it has nothing to do with the demographics of the people who came out in these cities across the nation, if it had nothing to do with race, if it had nothing to do with everything that of course connects to what Trump was articulating using his social media platform, but also even before January 6th, connecting to the events of 2016, where he had remarked that there were fine people on both sides. So not taking a stand, clearly giving this license to white supremacists to continue to terrorize people. If it had nothing to do with race, then I think we would not see the presence of the Confederate flag there. And as a historian, I understand when that flag shows up, what it means, and what it means specifically for Black people. It is a vision of America. It is an undemocratic vision of America that flag represents. It is a vision of America that does not include people who look like me as part of the polity, right? And so the presence of the flag was just one example to remind us how race is deeply connected, even when we say, or when others say it is about some sort of dissent or some sort of protest that has everything to do with all of these other matters that has nothing to do with race. Well, race is deeply embedded, and those who were at the Capitol revealed how race was embedded into the narrative by the things that came out of their mouth, certainly by what they said, but also, so certainly the rhetoric, but by the symbols that were represented there. And so I would challenge anyone who, and I know there are many people who would like to say, oh, it had nothing to do with race. Well, clearly, if you were paying attention to anything that was taking place under the Trump presidency, you would understand that it is impossible to disentangle race from a lot of what Trump's base was articulating, even at the very beginning of his presidency to the moment of the insurrection.
So let's shift to some of the audience questions.
Can I just,
please
bit here. Yeah, and I'll keep this brief because I think Keisha did a great job, covering the broad strokes and the complexity of this. We've been long debating for 5 years now how many people voted for Trump because he's a racist or in spite of his racism. So I think one lesson that Keisha has so well articulated is that there's no part of America we can separate out that is not embedded, as the word that she used, with questions about who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's deserving, who's not deserving, and the way that race helps to answer those questions, whether people admit it or not. So it's always race, racism, and that's just, parting thought for folks, or parting wisdom. The second thing is that, by way of analogy, I think it's really important. We have good evidence that there are millions of white women voters in this country who understood Trump's sexist, misogynist behavior, past and present, in the context of his presidential administration, and looked past it. They're probably not feminists, those same women, right? So one does not have to say that Trump's not a sexist or that Trump's voters are all feminists in spite of Trump's sexism. They can simply acknowledge that we can recognize the destructive behavior that an individual at his level as president of the United States is engaging in, can give complicit approval or tacit or active or passive approval of it, and therefore be implicated in that same destruction without having to parse the difference of whether, well, did they vote for him because he's a sexist or not a sexist or racist? Because that's ridiculous. The man was a sexist, racist, and therefore people who voted for him were either leaning fully into it or looking beyond it in some gesture of what I'd call innocence.
I'm so glad you jumped in and added that. And I would just also add, as a Black journalist, a lot of us have had discussions over these past several years just of how frustrating it has been to watch the media's coverage of now former President Trump. So thank you both for articulating that so well. So one audience question: how concerned are you that Republicans in many states are aggressively working to make voting more difficult in upcoming elections? And what strategy would you suggest to combat such efforts?
So it's certainly not surprising, and I think Khalil referenced this earlier, that every time, and we see this historically, every time that we've experienced some kind of progress within the Black community, there follows white backlash, and one should know. I think one should have expected that, given the significance of the Voting Rights Act of '65, that there would be widespread resistance and there would be efforts to dismantle and to detract from its power. And certainly, I think in just over the last couple of years, the Shelby ruling is one significant example of how efforts or how steps are being made to erode the Voting Rights Act. And it's not surprising that Republicans are already trying to come up with new strategies, although not so new, I would say repackaged old strategies. If you look at the period of Reconstruction, other moments where efforts were made to block Black people from voting, you can see the connections to the present. But it's not surprising that Republicans are trying to devise new strategies, especially because they saw the outcome, right, of the last election. And now it's a scramble to try to pull back so that by the time we get to the next election, the hope is that it would be easier for them to win. And so we have to be vigilant. I am concerned. I think we should be concerned. And this is where I emphasize the importance of grassroots activism and making sure that we are pushing forward, demanding that we don't just look the other way, demanding that we protect voting rights as much as possible. And so deeply concerned, but we all have to make sure that we don't allow this topic to fall to the wayside.
And Khalil, I have a question specific to something that you said earlier. So this person wants to know, what will change white behavior? What will change whites' innocence?
Well, it's such a simple question, but in the question is also, it's kind of like, asking an alcoholic asking someone, what will keep me from drinking? It's like, stop drinking. So educate yourself about the most effective protocols and interventions to get help, and so that you can have a lifestyle change. I mean, so there's a way in which, again, I think of this question because I'm surrounded. I mean, I happen to be a coastal person, right? I've lived on the East Coast for a long time. So I'm in these information bubbles with, lots of self-identified moderates and liberals, super well educated. Everybody's a high flyer. Every kid, all their children are gifted, this kind of thing. And I'm just always struck by, when it comes to trying to figure out how to get off of the racism addiction, people all of a sudden are like, I don't understand. Like, tell me what to do. So there's something in the question that is disingenuous. People first have to educate themselves. If they truly don't understand, if they truly have lingering doubts, maybe Black people really aren't as smart as my kids in the average. Maybe when I look in a classroom and I see a majority of Black children and my kid's been assigned that classroom, and there's something about me saying this must be the wrong classroom, like lean into that. Like either that's gonna be your racism albatross or you're gonna change. And I could give 15,000 examples of how that shows up in all sorts of places all around. So people have to look themselves in the mirror and say, you know what, I was likely socialized in a way to accept a whole lot of racist ideas about people of color, and particularly Black and brown people. And I'm gonna have to unlearn a lot of this. The harder part to me is that once you figure that out, then you're gonna have to lean into making some different choices. And people get really squirrely about sacrifice when it comes to voting for people who, you know, sound too radical. What does this America look like with all these people and their crazy ideas and BLM in charge, right? So you have to kind of start with where you are and then back into a series of decision points that are likely to happen if you lean fully into this. And then the last thing I'll say is, if you're not up to it, if you're 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and it feels too much, you're too far gone. And I don't mean because you're an unrepentant racist with a Klan hood in your closet. I'm just saying like the behavior change is just too hard, right? Giving up, like, you know, not drinking during COVID, too much wine, you know, all this kind of examples. Then I'd say focus on your child. Focus on young people who are white in your community, who should be socialized to anti-racism in a way that requires building different muscles for them, different social practices for them, different understandings that being colorblind is a form of racism, because it abets the status quo and essentially says that the normal and universal is a white standard and a white person, which then creates, you know, the track for assimilation for everybody else, which of course is itself the dominant form of cultural supremacy in this country.
That is what I call a mic drop moment. I mean, what a way to just summarize, and what a powerful answer. But I would love to get Keisha in on this, just with a minor tweak though. Do you think that there is an unwillingness, specifically among white liberals, to really frankly address and confront their complicitness in the racism that has been allowed to permeate in America?
Absolutely. You know, it is, I think, for me, it has been a difficult process to observe individuals who claim to be allies, and they boldly claim to be allies. You know, they walk around with the Black Lives Matter T-shirt, and they have the, you know, the stickers, and they have the symbol, and you know, on their lawns, and so they put out this very public, you know, idea that they are standing with Black people and they understand and they're committed to the work, and then watch these same people in various spaces. So even, you know, as a professor, I see that a lot. I see individuals who, you know, have the Black Lives Matter signature on their emails, but then there's a conversation about hiring or about promotion, and you listen to what comes out of their mouths, and then you recognize that this is a person who has not even grappled with their own bias and their own racist views, and yet they see themselves, right, as part of the solution. They see themselves as part of the struggle. And, you know, these are the folks who would have said in the 60s, I marched with King, and, you know, sure, congrats, you did that. But here's the point, you know, as Khalil emphasized earlier, there's so much material out there, so much resources. It's almost overwhelming when you see all that has been produced to help people accept reality and to open up their eyes and to be honest with themselves. And yet, I think there is a refusal to change. That's my interpretation, that there is a refusal to change. There is a willingness to give gestures, and there's a willingness to offer symbols, because that's easy. It's easy to say Black Lives Matter, or easier than actually changing one's behavior and one's practices. So I think that we certainly have to as Khalil said, make a demand of people to not sit around waiting for others to give them the answers, but to take an active role in their education or re-education.
And so with the last question, I would kind of like to dig a little bit deeper into that, the points that both of you just made, and to kind of circle back to what I said earlier, that this fight, this struggle cannot be on the shoulders of Black Americans and people of color alone. So what is the role of allyship, and what does that look like? And floating in this last audience question, how do you feel we can help to expand the commitment to learning from the past, especially in parts of the country where racism is still most widespread? Although one addition, I would argue that racism is everywhere in America.
I'll take a quick stab at this. I mean, if the Trump moment teaches us anything, it teaches us that we are all in this society together and we are all on this planet together. So let's take climate change. The man rescinds the Paris Accords, which of course create the conditions for the United States to not be part of a frantic effort to solve this climate crisis problem, or at least to reduce carbon emissions anytime soon. Around the world, and here in the United States, those in the global South and those below sea level, like the victims of the man-made disaster abetted by a natural disaster in Louisiana and New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, are the ones most likely to suffer death and destruction in the midst of this ongoing tragedy that's unfolding in terms of an existential crisis. Our democracy itself literally has been on life support, and every person knows it. And some people who are Trump supporters actually wanted to destroy the democracy because as people have been enfranchised means that America might in fact change. So my parting thought is this: if between the existential threat of climate change and the implications that we could elect people through racist ideas and racial scapegoating of the other, as well as through the problem that came with the threat to our democracy, is not enough of a reason for white people to change their behavior and see this not as helping Black people, but as literally solving a 500-year-old problem that was about oppression and the appropriation of land and labor of other people. Like this is yet another inflection point to turn the page on that history, because at the end of the day, the world will suffer for the commitment and addiction to racism, whether it runs from Klan card-holding members or Proud Boys, or whether it is the liberal do-gooder featured in Nice White Parents by the New York Times and Serial.
Keisha?
Wow, there's not much I can add. Khalil really laid it out. I think in a nutshell, when we think about allyship, I would simply say that allies have to be willing to put themselves in an uncomfortable position. And I say that because if you are someone who claimed to be an ally and you see an act of injustice, but you're not willing to say anything about it, you're not willing to address it, and you're looking for the person of color in the room to speak up and point it out when you've already seen it, then you know that ultimately you're not serious about this allyship, because in the end, it has to be about putting yourself on the line, and that means being uncomfortable at times. And if you're too comfortable in your allyship, I suspect it's because you're not doing half of what you need to be doing. So I hope that someone takes something from that.
Dr. Blain and Dr. Muhammad, thank you so much. And with that, I'll kick it back to Gavin to end our discussion.
Thank you, Kat.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for this important conversation. To our audience, thank you for your questions. Thank you to WGBH for your partnership this evening in producing this program. And to our distinguished panelists, Dr. Keisha Blain and Dr. Khalil Muhammad, and to our moderator, Kat Stafford, thank you for digging amazingly quickly and deeply into the history and structures that have created these systems we must address, as well as the calls to action we must heed. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you and have a good evening.